that the police needed to be taken off the streets. West Midlands Police have appealed for the mother of a newborn baby whose body was found in a supermarket car park in Bilston to contact them. Officers say they're concerned for her welfare. Non-essential shops, hairdressers and gyms in England are preparing to reopen tomorrow with the easing of COVID lockdown restrictions. In Wales, all shops will reopen and all pupils will return to the classroom. The British Retail Consortium is calling on shoppers to respect staff in stores and obey social distancing rules. And police in Bangkok say the managers of 2 nightclubs thought to be responsible for large coronavirus clusters have been jailed for 2 months. Hundreds of cases have been traced to the Crystal and Emerald adult nightclubs in the Thai capital. BBC News.
One of the first questions is often, have you got brothers or sisters? And I couldn't say no.
Spotlight moments that change lives.
The only way I knew how to fix it was to gamble. It was just unbelievable. It brings you right back to that moment.
BBC Radio 4's new series with Jane Garvey.
It's all about the grey areas, the ups and downs, and the positive stuff.
I don't have any anger, a complete absence. And people find that really hard to understand.
Life changing.
Available now on BBC Sounds.
In half an hour, inspired by the rock climbing adventures of the all-female Pinnacle Club, the poet Helen Mort will be imagining what mountains might remember of the women who climbed them. That's in Recall of the Rock at 4:30 here on BBC Radio 4, where now it's time to join Johnny Pitts for Open Book.
Yes, that's an actual high street you can hear in the background, because today on Open Book, after a tough winter in lockdown, we're opening the windows, stretching our limbs and stepping out into spring. Later I'll be chatting to Naomi Ishiguro about her refreshing debut, Common Ground, a novel in which 2 very different people are brought together by the great outdoors. And in the spirit of spring cleaning, we'll be discussing the joys and drudgeries of clearing out the clutter with Eleanor Ray and Jess Kidd. But first, a perfect Peckham spring day for me, not so long ago, that I would take for granted pre-pandemic, would involve a peek in the South London Gallery, then a stroll by the blossoms and silver birches that fringe Bushy Hill Road. I'd cut through Warwick Gardens and maybe stop off for an Americano, followed by a browse in Review Bookshop. It's one of my local favourites, which, like many bookshops across England and Wales, will reopen this week, with those in Scotland and Northern Ireland hopefully following later in the month. And I'm very pleased to say that I'm here with Ben Pope, who is the manager of Review Bookshop in Peckham. Hi, Ben. Ben, I've walked past the front of your shop longingly over the past few months, and I've noticed that you keep the window display up to date. Why is that?
Well, it's been a really important resource over the last 6 months or so, because obviously we can't have people in the shop, or we have been able to have some obviously before Christmas, but in the main we've just not been able to have customers kind of browse, which is like the main resource of a bookshop. It's the main thing most people love about it. So come inside, look at stuff. There's a bit of atmosphere. You can read a few pages of stuff. You get to see what's new. So in order to try and replicate that, I suppose, we've been keeping the windows as up to date as possible, trying to put our favorite stuff in there, push things that we particularly love. So yeah, it's been absolutely vital as a resource.
Yeah, because the great thing about bookshops, especially the smaller ones like Review, is the bookseller customer dynamic. I've just missed going to my favourite section and looking at all these little handwritten staff pics that you've got. How have you got around the loss of that interaction?
Yeah, it's been an interesting kind of scrabble in order to try and find new ways. Social media obviously has been like a huge part of it. We regularly post stuff on Twitter and Instagram, just trying to either take photos of things that we don't think that would get enough heat normally. We often we use bookshop.org, which is like this new sort of conglomeration of independent bookshops that allow you to list things by theme or things that you particularly like, and that's proved like a really helpful sort of process for putting out our recommendations, things that like we want to get some more light on.
I wanted to ask more about the books that you've got in the window. I noticed you've got some really current books. In fact, you've got Naomi Ishiguro's Common Ground, and we'll be speaking to Naomi later in the show. Could you tell us what you're excited for that's kind of coming out over the spring?
There's a few things that we're particularly excited about. Topically, there's a really fantastic one that's just come out called This Is How We Come Back Stronger, which is like a collection of feminist essays about how to sort of turn the crisis of the last year into some actual real change. We've got a couple of local authors who we're really excited about, particularly The Cracks That Let the Light In by Jess Moxham and Surrogate by Susan Spindler, which are two sort of very different fiction and non-fiction takes on very different elements of motherhood. And something actually I just finished this morning, which is really fantastic, The Yak Dilemma, which is like a collection of poetry by Supriya Dalawal, which is published by Makina Books, I think. And that's again like this really fascinating kind of look at rootlessness. And yeah, it's probably quite a good one for these sort of very anti-globe-trotting times. It's very kind of gives you a look into many different cultures from one person's perspective.
I really like what you said about sort of supporting local writers. Have you found that the pandemic has taken its toll on kind of independent publishers? And do you see that?
I think it's been really interesting from our perspective because it definitely has taken a toll. But I also think that there's been, in the same way with a lot of businesses across all industries, there's been a kind of contraction back to what is local and what you can walk to in your, in your local area. And I think a lot of independent publishers probably, and so I mean, this certainly goes for us as a business, we've seen a lot more interest from people who are around and about. So a lot of indie publishers have been in touch trying to get us to, forward their books. We've been really keen to because we know them personally or because we know that they're local to the area. So I think there's been a lot of more kind of grassroots support has sort of sprung up or at least strengthened.
And as a bookseller, what does it mean kind of opening up the shop again after all this time? What have you missed and what are you really looking forward to?
I think it's the kind of, it's like we were saying at the beginning, recommendations. It's really lovely to have someone come in and just have absolutely no idea what they want and to say, I'm in your hands, like what would you recommend? And that just gives me sort of carte blanche to show them 9 or 10 different things that they might be interested in that I'm really passionate about. And that like kind of sharing, that aspect of sharing is really lovely. That's like the reason to do it. That's really that's the whole shebang. So that has been a real shame to let that go, and it's very exciting for that to come back. I was when I first started working here, I was really surprised at how people are so keen to just walk through the door and sort of hand themselves to you and just say, tell me what's good. And they are just, they'll come in, they'll say that, I will sit down and find some things, you could have a discussion. It's a really lovely thing, and I'm really looking forward to getting back to it.
My thanks to Ben Pope from Review Bookshop in Peckham, London. Now, back in the studio and to a novelist who knows well the joys of bookshops, having worked for a number of years at that Bath institution, Mr. B's Book Emporium. Hot off the back of her collection of short stories, Escape Routes, so apt for 2020, the year in which it was published, Naomi Ishiguro has returned with her debut novel, Common Ground. It's the story of Stan, a meek 13-year-old boy being bullied at the posh private school he won a scholarship for and suffering at his suburban home after the loss of his father. Out of school hours, however, he meets his saviour, Charlie, a 16-year-old Romany traveller, wise beyond his years, who can box and fix bikes. A deep friendship is formed, but can it survive the years and the rising pressures of class, culture and geography in a changing Britain? And I'm happy to say that I'm joined by Naomi Ishiguro now. Welcome, Naomi. What I enjoyed most about this novel, I think, was its lightness of touch. Despite some pretty tragic events, this really is a celebration of friendship, isn't it? What brings these two quite different young people together in the first place?
Thanks for having me, first of all. I think, first of all, I was thinking quite a lot about public space and the importance of literal public space and literal common ground as I was writing it. And the two main characters literally meet on a common, so a big area of green public space in their town. And I was thinking, where else would these two very different people where would their paths cross? So on a literal level, that's what brings them together. But I was interested in looking at the actual more sort of metaphorical common grounds underneath that sort of literal level, and finding the threads that they were both looking for in this friendship that they strike up. So while on the surface of it, it seems that they're very different and from very different worlds, they both have quite similar interests and needs and come at the world in a quite similar way. So I think they sort of find shared ground in their friendship.
They do, but that's at risk by a kind of politics of space, isn't it, in the current moment? And the beginning of this novel made me think of Nick Hayes' Book of Trespass. But in your novel, it's this piece of common land that makes this friendship possible initially. In lockdown, I think a lot of us have rediscovered natural landscapes, especially as sites of friendship. Could you tell us more about this common and the role the outdoors plays in your novel?
I like writing that feels like sort of writing of the outdoors in general. I wanted the book to feel slightly like a breath of fresh air, but I was absolutely very interested in sort of the idea of, at the moment, the government is sort of, as part of the policing bill, and moving to criminalise trespass, which makes a whole section of the GRT communities sort of effectively like illegal in the way that they're living. So those thoughts were all very much on my mind, ideas of trespass, private land, public space, and how important public space is. But I think that sort of being outside and the importance of green spaces, I was writing this book before lockdown, but it's definitely something that's always been hugely important to me. And yeah, it's kind of interesting to see how that's happened in the last year.
I want to ask you more about the Romani community a little bit later on, but for now, let's hear a passage that really encapsulates that sense of possibility that the common offers.
They would sit on the grass while Charlie rolled cigarettes or smoked, and Stan watched the beginnings of the sunset, or the trees with their tops all swaying in the wind. And Charlie would talk about things Stan had never heard of or thought about before, like the gigs he'd been to with his dad up in Manchester, or stuff to do with boxing or with motorbikes, mainly about how good his dad was at fixing them. He'd talk about the stuff he'd done with various girls in the different places he'd lived, and then he'd talk too about all the odd things he knew, about stuff that had happened or about people that had lived in the past who Stan had never even heard of, often having something to do with Newford. Stan found those the most interesting bits, really. Not because he wasn't interested in music or motorbikes or boxing or girls, but because the things Charlie told him showed Newford in a new light, making this small hometown of his seem suddenly peppered with interesting sparks of history. It was, too, simply Charlie's sheer open curiosity about places and their pasts that had Stan interested. At school, in spite of everything Stan had been told before he got there about how clever everyone at St. Reginald's would be, intellectual apathy was rapidly becoming the most reliable index of coolness. Anyone who worked hard and cared about reading or thinking or learning anything was a loser inherently. Stan, the biggest loser of them all, with his nose always in a book. Charlie wasn't uncool though, wasn't a nerd or a geek. Charlie didn't even go to school. And yet he was so curious, always finding this stuff out and thinking about it, what it meant, why it was interesting.
Naomi, if the common provides the stage for this friendship, really it's also the innocence of youth that allows this friendship to blossom. And it exists in a world where it's the adults who are the main drivers of hostility. And the narrative moves from Stan and Charlie as boys to 9 years later when they're young men. What were you trying to explore with this passage of time?
Yeah, with the passage of time, there's a break in the novel of 9 years between 2003, where the first section, in which the first section takes place, and 2012. And I was in the 2012 section. I was quite interested in how not just the characters' perspectives on the world and how they're treated has changed as they've gotten older and run into more of the sort of harsh realities of things, but also the change in the overall sort of discourse and culture around multiculturalism that occurred in that time between 2003 and 2012, which still in many ways felt like a very sort of open and positive time with the Olympics and all the sort of discourse around that. But then also that was the year, I think, that the hostile environment policy was introduced. So there was definitely a sort of tension coming in that time as well.
And it was really interesting the way you explored prejudice that the traveller community faces. I don't know much about the Romani community, I have to admit, but it really rang true to me at least. Did you consult with the community? And what was your process in terms of like doing the research?
Yeah, so I will say I'm definitely like not an expert, and I don't want people to sort of read the book and think, oh, like it's a way to consult with it with an expert. But I definitely did talk to a lot of people who were very, helpful and brilliantly supportive about what I was trying to do, because I did worry about all these questions around cultural appropriation and how right it is for me, as someone who isn't from that community, to attempt to tell the story. And I read a lot as well as talking to people. I read brilliant books. The Traveller's Times is an amazing online newspaper. I read a lot of Damien Labar's work as well. He's a brilliant writer, and I found his work really inspiring.
There's something in this book that I found inspiring, actually, and it was this notion of ne passaran, which I'd never heard about before. Could you tell listeners who might not be familiar with it what this ne passaran is, and kind of how it connects Stan and Charlie in a certain way?
I'm glad that you said you found that inspiring, and also interesting that you hadn't come across the story before. I came across it. A colleague told me this at my old job at a bookshop. So it connects the two main characters in the book, because Charlie, he knows the story. He sort of collected it as one of the stories that he tells and thinks is important to tell, and it's a true story of something that happened in the 70s, where these fighter jet engines turned up at this factory in East Kilbride for repairs, and the workers there realised that they'd come from Chile and they'd been used in the violent military coup over there, and they refused to mend them in solidarity with the people of Chile. And Ne Passaran was their kind of rallying cry for this solidarity action, because it's sort of a Scottish-fied version of No Passaran, meaning they shall not pass. And I found that story really inspiring, and it's something that Charlie tells Stan in the book, and that they sort of have this Ne Passaran thing that they say to each other as a refrain throughout the narrative. And it was important to me, the idea of solidarity, that the boys, the characters, are inspired by it and want to sort of carry it on in some way, that story has travelled.
You don't hear that word banded around very often amongst working class communities these days, do you? Solidarity. You mentioned earlier Damien Labar's work, and I noticed you thanked him at the end of your book, and you also thanked your father, who obviously needs no introduction, Kazuo Ishiguro. I was listening recently to my co-presenter Elizabeth Day interviewing your dad, and he was saying how the writing of his new novel, Clara and the Sun, was really like a family effort, that after reading what he thought was a final draft of his book, you sent him away to work on it for another 4 months. Does it work the other way around too, or did you prefer to keep a kind of distance from your dad with your debut?
With my dad, I try not to show him my work. I don't show anyone my work until I think it's finished, and then I'll show it to a small circle of readers, like my parents and a few people I know from university, various friends that I've come across I trust as readers. And then I'll get their feedback and sort of do a few more changes, and then I submit it to my agent. So it's not so much my dad specifically. I just find it quite hard to show lots of people before, when it's in the writing process. I like to sort of have it more or less done before other people kind of weigh in. Otherwise, I sort of lose my thread.
And you used to, speaking of readers, you used to work in a bookshop, and with bookshops opening this week, and you're looking forward to finally seeing physical copies on the shelves and checking to see if you've made any staff picks.
I am really looking forward to that, and I just miss going to bookshops myself. I'm a serial haunter of bookshops. I love independent bookshops specifically, and I love chatting to booksellers. I always think that's the best way to get recommendations, because they all invariably know their stuff so well. And it's just there's such beautiful, inspiring environments to spend time in. So I'm very excited to see Common Ground on the shelves and to get browsing again.
My thanks to Naomi Ishiguro, and Common Ground is out now, published by Tinder Press. Finally today, as we tentatively, hopefully, emerge out of lockdown, it's maybe time to get rid of that surplus of jogging bottoms and use up the dusty stacks of emergency toilet roll clogging up our pantries. And after some of the recommendations today, maybe make space on our bookshelves too. To give some insights on the art of the spring clean is Eleanor Ray, whose new novel Everything is Beautiful is a funny, tender and uplifting book about a hoarder whose problem with objects in her overflowing house is rooted to the past. And I'm also joined by Jess Kidd, whose books include The Hoarder and her latest children's book called Everyday Magic, which is what we could do with a bit of as we clear out our homes. Eleanor, I want to come to you first. I know someone personally who's affected by hoarding disorder, and of course it's often intimately connected to some kind of emotional trauma. Could you tell us more about Amy, the things she collects and why she collects them?
Yes, of course. So Amy started off as an artist, but by the time the book opens, she's become a hoarder. But that isn't a word she'd ever use to describe herself. She doesn't see herself that way. She just collects objects that she believes to be beautiful, hence the title of the book. But they can be things that many people would probably consider rubbish. Chipped mugs, translucent empty wine bottles that catch the light, dried husks of honeysuckle, among many other things. And we learn that the reason this hoarding began was the unexplained disappearance of her boyfriend and her best friend at the same time, which she eventually puts down to betrayal.
You know, I'm not a hoarder, but those things that you mentioned really resonate with me. I do find beauty in a broken bottle, and sometimes have to think twice before I do eventually throw it away. Eleanor, could you read us a passage that really shows just how kind of out of control this interest in everyday objects has got for Amy?
It was Saturday morning, so Amy picked up her jeans and a black t-shirt. She made a special effort not to catch a glimpse of herself as she dressed. It was a challenge, as many mirrors lined the room. She knew that mirrors were meant to make a room feel spacious, but today it felt as if they were making the room smaller. Piles of boxes were reflected back at her, towering up and reaching for the ceiling. But even so, many things could not fit in a box and instead littered the room. Vases, unopened bottles of hand lotion, stacks of ashtrays, and the mirrors themselves, of course, mocking her with infinite reflections.
Eleanor Ray there reading her book, Everything is Beautiful. Jess Kidd, if I could come to you, many of the things Eleanor has touched upon about, you know, finding beauty in everyday objects resonates with your book, The Hoarder, too. But you look more specifically at how items of little value take on an almost magical significance. Could you tell us a bit more about that?
Absolutely. Well, Maud Drennan is a care worker, and she's been tasked with taking care of Mr. Flood, who's an ancient, belligerent hoarder who lives alone in his West London mansion, full to the rafters of all sorts of stuff. And as she starts to sift through the junk of ages, this unsolved mystery comes to light. And it's almost as if Mr. Flood's house is communicating with her through the objects that resurface, through the general kind of clutter. But as she starts to dig deeper, she really starts to disturb the ghosts of her own traumatic past. So their stories are linked together.
It's really interesting. Yeah, what is treasure and what is junk? Could you give us a reading, Jess?
Yeah, well, this is Maud Drennan, and she's introducing the belligerent Mr. Flood. He has a curious way of moving through his rubbish. He leans into it, skimming down the corridors like a fearless biker on a hairpin bend. He gallops and vaults through the valleys and hills, canters and bobs through the outcrops and gorges of his improbable hoardings. Now and then he stops to climb over an obstacle, folding his long legs like picnic chairs, and all the while his chin juts up and out and his body hangs beneath it, as if his grizzled jaw is wired to an invisible puppeteer. And all the while the backs of his big and gnarly hands brush over the surfaces. For a tall man and an old man, he can shift himself when he wants to. I don't move like that. I wade, tripping over boxes and piles of mildewing curtains, getting caught in cables hooked on hat stands and assaulted by rutting ironing boards. I flounder over records, books, stained blankets, greasy collections of plastic bags, garden forks, antique mangles, a woman's patent leather shoe, an unopened blender that also grates and peels, and cats, cats, cats.
A reading from The Hoarder there. Jess, you're obviously interested in characters whose lives are filled with things. Even in your new children's book, Everyday Magic, the young boy Alfie is in awe of the amount of books his Aunt Gertrude has. Both of your characters hold on to text, as I do, I have to admit, you know, whether it's newspapers, cookbooks or notes, which are often seen as clutter. Why? And are they actually clutter in the same way as your normal object?
Well, I suppose it stems from my own horror of clutter in a way. I mean, I would love to have a clutter-free existence, but I mean, the hoarder came about because I sort of had an inherited hoard, if you like. So I came by some of my late father's possessions. And so that kind of raised the questions, as you say, about the idea that an object might have an intrinsic connection to a past life or a memory and that sort of thing. So I suppose really I wanted to explore this kind of drive to acquire or drive to collect, as opposed to this kind of ability for objects to kind of overwhelm us. So they give us security, but also overwhelm us, and they connect us to our past selves. In the Hoarder, Maud is separated from her kind of ability to move through the house by a wall that Mr. Flood builds from National Geographic. So the text kind of literally becomes an obstacle in the book.
Eleanor, would you agree that there's something different about having lots of books? Because people don't really complain about that too often, do they? It's not books we don't want to see in someone's house.
I think there's a difference between hoarding and collecting. When you collect something, you're kind of in control of it. It's ordered. You're in charge. Whereas when you're hoarding, it's really the objects that are in charge of you. So it's interesting, when I was researching hoarding, books, newspapers, sources of information are one of the categories of things that people like to hoard, like to keep hold of. And it's that kind of thirst for information. And it doesn't matter that they know it might all be available on the internet. A hoarder will want to keep that physical copy. And then there's those people who collect things because of the emotional value. And I think that's something that Jess mentioned. It's equating feelings for an object to a person, even if the thing is actually quite far removed. So Amy's actually mainly in that category. She collects hundreds of mugs, for example, and adores each one. She sees them as beautiful because they remind her of a happier time, even though they might very much have been in the background to that time and how she felt then.
Yeah, and Amy almost sees her future in these objects. And I think that's what it is about books, specifically with me, even the ones that I haven't read yet and I maybe will never read, is that they sort of embody the notion of who I might become. I remember on social media a while ago that very gentle and often wise Marie Kondo provoked a hilarious backlash when she suggested that people should get rid of books, that she only keeps 30 at any one time. With things reopening, including charity shops where lots of us send our books, do you plan to clear out your own bookshelves, or would that be sacrilege, Eleanor?
I can't bear to get rid of books. I love holding on to them. I always like to think that I can go back and reread them if I want to. It's very rare that I read a book once and I think that's it. And even if I'm not going to read it again, just seeing the spine on the shelf reminds me of the emotions I experienced at that time.
And Jess, are you the same? Do you hold on to books, or are you quite good with passing them on?
Oh, well, I think I'm quite good at passing them on. But I think also there is this kind of emotional content that objects seem to have. I suppose it's so linked to our identity and our memories and things. So we almost feel that we have a duty towards keeping those objects. So it's quite difficult, especially books. I mean, when I was sort of doing readings and events with the Hoarder, readers would come up to me and say, well, I'm either the hoarder or I know the hoarder. And we sort of agreed that books were exempt from the hoarding situation. But I think there is nothing quite like that connection with a book, especially a book with a bit of marginalia where you might have scribbled notes in, or someone you loved scribbled notes in. It just feels like a tangible connection.
Absolutely. We often talk to writers about the book they never lend. What would be the one book you wouldn't want to lose in a spring clean, Jess?
Well, I think it would be my father's copy of Robbie Burns' poetry, which I really definitely wouldn't want to lose in a radical spring clean, because it just has little drawings in, and it brings me back to various times, sitting on his lap, hearing the poems read, but also going back to it years later. So I think it allows you to connect at various different points in your life, which is the fascination with objects.
Yeah, it's more about the object and your memories tied to it than the actual text itself often, isn't it? Eleanor, have you got a certain book that you would just your prized possession?
I do, and it's for similar reasons. It's a particular copy of The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn that I won in a school short story writing competition back when I was 11. And I remember getting it and thinking it was the most beautiful book I'd ever seen. It has a leather effect cover and gold lettering. And it was a long time before I'd even dare to read the book because I wanted to keep it pristine, which is unusual for me because normally I'm awful with books. I scribble all over them. I make notes in the margins. I fold pages over, which I know is a sacrilege. But this one, it's absolutely perfect still.
Well, many thanks, Eleanor Ray and Jess Kidd. Eleanor's novel, Everything is Beautiful, is out now, published by Piatkas, and Jess's Everyday Magic is out now, published by Canongate. Well, that's all from me today. Next week, Elizabeth is back talking to Chris Power about his compelling Berlin set novel, A Lonely Man, which opens appropriately in a bookshop. And with the Swipe Right series on Radio 4 at the moment, she'll be talking about the joys of dating today. Join her then.
Open Book was presented by Johnny Pitts and produced by Kieran Birmingham.
5 stories starring Mackenzie Crook, dramatised and narrated by Toby Jones. Marco Valdo perceived not just the changes of the season. One night's rain will be enough. Then he'll be ready to pick. But the yearnings